Hello, and welcome to another episode of today's Balanced Leader. Your friend and host, Caroline, here with Tim McCleary, founder and managing director of the Involvement Practice, the leading culture activation company based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tim combined a 20-year career in leadership positions with companies such as NBC, Warner Brothers, and GE, with 17 years of experience at the Involvement Practice to develop involvement culture, an approach that drives individual, team, and organizational growth. Under his leadership, the Involvement Practice has partnered with some of the world's most recognizable brands to foster thriving, high-trust workplace environments that deliver measurable ROI. Known for his empathetic, action-oriented approach, Tim is passionate about unlocking the full potential of people and organizations by focusing on the root causes of behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. Welcome to today's Balanced Leader, Tim.
Thanks, Caroline. It's great to be here. It's great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. So for listeners, everybody knows I share my world. And so Tim and I actually went to high school together and have had the pleasure of watching and stalking each other on LinkedIn. And now we're back to collaborate. So
It's
excited
amazing that
to
that
have
was
you
only
here.
10 years ago, Caroline. 10 years ago.
That's right. That's right. If only things I would do differently, Tim. Oh, hindsight is always tough, but yeah, so let's dig in because this is such a hot topic and I want to make sure we get to the meat and potatoes of what you do. And
Mhm.
so let me ask you my first question. You emphasize the root causes of behaviors, attitude, and beliefs in shaping workplace culture. And I so love that because that's part of the work that I do as a coach. But in your experience, what are the most common hidden drivers behind disengagement in organizations, and how do leaders often misdiagnose them?
Yeah, it's a great first question. And I like the fact that you use the word hidden because people are complex, as you know. We're highly complex. And yet there are things that make us that are common across human beings, no matter where they are in the world. I think some of the things that can be hidden is a lack of purpose or a lack of psychological safety, which we think of as trust, even clearly defined roles where we find that people end up overlapping other people's work, which can lead to silos and people being very protective of their work. But it's also very often a misdiagnosis of what's really going on. And much like I'll use a personal experience that you and I talked about briefly before this episode, we often can't see what's right in front of us. So we think we know what's happening when in fact there's something underlying. And very often, I can't be the one to ask you that as my employee to understand some of those root causes, to start to unearth some of these issues. But a third party can do that very effectively. We went through a repositioning of the Involvement Practice brand after almost 18 years. We just did this back in December. I hired a small firm out of London, England to help me with this. And I said to them, you're going to see stuff that I can't see anymore because I'm just too close to the brand, to the work we do. And we want to be really clear about what we do, how we do it, and the value, most importantly, the value we can bring to the clients that we serve. They were able to cut through all that and say, here's what we see. And then we were able to take action against that. And that's the advantage of bringing a third party in. I'm not trying to self-promote here, but we do a culture diagnostic, and it's really the first thing that we do. It's a starting point to understand what's really going on inside an organization. And from that, we can unearth what's working really well inside the culture. So we're not always looking for just the problems. Let's find the things that are working really well, and let's elevate those. Let's put more focus on those, because that's the secret sauce often inside a culture. But then let's also look at the things that need improvement. So what our culture diagnostic looks like very briefly is a conversation with a cross-section of team members, depending on the size of the team. That can be quite a large cross-section. Sometimes it's very small, but we want to get lots of different points of view. And we go into those, they're 45 minutes to an hour each. We go into them letting the people that we're interviewing know that everything they say is both anonymous and confidential. And we do this on purpose. We want them to feel a sense of trust. We're very rigid about that. We will not go back and share, even if a client says, "Oh, what happened in that we won't share it. That's really important to us, having an open, honest conversation with an individual on a team. And what we find very quickly is some people will say, "Well, there's nothing I wouldn't share with you that I haven't shared with my manager," which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have other people who you can see are sitting back a bit, and it takes 45 minutes into the hour we have with them to see their body language relax, to see them starting to lean in and be ready to engage. And some people never do. Some people are very guarded for good reason.
Right.
And we can get that sense. But it allows us to get to a point where we get verbatim what's really going on inside the culture. We can present that back to the client lead. We do a very, very simple report on that with an executive summary. It's very graphical, so it's easy to read it. You don't have to pour through pages and pages of spreadsheets. Our clients seem to really love that because it just allows them to get to what's really going on and what can we do about it.
I love how you take the opportunity to really listen to the employees, really listen to what it is that is important to them, and shift kind of that fear of what's happening into, hey, this is a third party company that just may be able to change the culture in a company that potentially I quite enjoy working at and I plan on staying at, but it's going to make it so much more effective and allow that trust to build again, right? For employees to have
Correct.
that voice again.
That's right. And it's important that they trust us in that process. But what we find time and time again is they want to be heard. And it's very likely that apart from annual surveys and pulse surveys and many of the tools that are out there that are good tools and give us insights into what's going on in a culture, but sometimes people play the game, right? And they tell us what we think we want to hear, so we don't, or they take it to the extreme and it's all complaining about what's wrong with the culture. Neither of those extremes are terribly helpful. But when we can get to a conversation where they feel relaxed enough to share with us, that's when we get to the insights that are going to allow us to do something really impactful for them and for the culture overall.
Yeah. So, thinking about that, Tim, I've worked for a number of companies and have dealt with a number of companies. And a lot of times leaders and when I say leaders, I mean, generally speaking at the executive level, feel that their culture is fine until a crisis
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be a change that isn't accepted. Sometimes it's because layoffs occur and all of a sudden people can become vocal, or you start to see things now that those people are no longer there. They start to expose those cracks that I call, right? So what do you think, for leaders listening, what are the silent warning signs that they should be watching for before something like that happens and it's too late?
Yeah. Typically, we'll see disengaged workers, people who are just not focused on their work. They're maybe leaving a little early, coming in late, just some signals that they're just really not engaged anymore. We see siloed work, or what I call self-preservation, which happens certainly when there are layoffs. People will get down under the radar naturally, makes a lot of sense. And that's when silos form. If you and I are on the same team and I saw our colleague just get laid off, you're on your own, Caroline. I'm going to protect myself now. I'm going to make sure that I'm producing. And so that creates a really difficult dynamic inside the organization when it's a time that they really should be coming together. High turnover of high performers. High performers will often jump ship when they see the ship is starting to sink. And then the quality of conversations, I think, as well, that leaders are having with their team members, are people being a lot more guarded. Are they being authentic? Are they being vulnerable? Those are indications that they still trust. And if that's breaking down, then we know that the culture is beginning to get fractured or become
I've even
fractured.
seen it when a leader who would typically be vocal in a positive way, come up with ideas, share their opinion about something maybe their colleagues are presenting with them. All of a sudden, when they start to become more quiet in
Yep.
meetings,
Yeah.
That is definitely a sign of something, right? Doesn't
Yes.
necessarily mean business specific, could be in their personal life, but there's
Yeah.
definitely something going on that you don't want to just sweep under the carpet. You want to explore to
Mhm.
see how best to support them and see if you truly have a problem, because you never know what's going on, right? And maybe there's
Right.
a challenge in the business that they're dealing with that they've never dealt with before, but yet they're afraid to raise their hand and say, you know what, I need some help here.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think and I love the episode that you recorded with Lisa Rigoli, and she just has really simple but practical. And now I know they're really not that simple, but they very practical approaches to HR practices. But a lot of that interview you did with her, and listeners haven't heard it yet, that's an episode you should go back and listen to.
Thank you.
It comes down to treating people like human beings. And when we're going through a change ourselves as a leader, they are too. It's just at a different pace.
Right.
We're hearing about it maybe 3 months ahead of the time or a couple of weeks ahead of the time. They're hearing it for the first time, and we need to hang on to what we felt as a leader, knowing that that's exactly what our team members are are going to experience and go through. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. We want the same things. We do a lot of work around the world. We have a global team of 20, which helps us lean into the different cultures that we work with around the world. I can think of a specific client. As you can understand, Caroline, I can't name clients.
Sure.
You can see a number of ours on our website. We have dealt with a lot of very large name brand companies, one of whom said, listen, we're rolling out a new strategy. We're going to start in Houston, Texas, and then move to Florence, Italy, and on to Singapore. And we'd like you to take them through an experience that will help them understand the strategy and how to activate it. So our job is not to tell people, our job is to involve them. We call ourselves involvers at the involvement practice. Now, we were warned what works in Houston isn't going to work in Florence, and it's not going to work in Singapore. And they gave us all the reasons for that. That when you get to Florence, you're going to find that the Italians may not understand your sense of humor. They're going to start talking to each other in Italian because that's where they're more comfortable. You're going to have to speak more slowly. Okay, we're certainly used to all that, and that is so critical to the work we do in culture.
Mm-hmm.
We honor those differences and celebrate them when we're
Yep.
working with different cultures. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We want a sense of purpose. We want to feel a sense of safety and fulfillment. It didn't take 5 minutes in Florence for all of that to just melt away. And now we were a bunch of human beings in a room together, working on these experiences, taking them through these experiences. They were engaging with us and laughing with us. Yes, they were talking Italian to each other, but not all the time. They were also talking English, knowing that we were in the room and didn't speak Italian. So my point being that we do have to listen to those cultural cautions and be aware of our own experiences, having done a lot of travel, but that at the end of the day, we're just human beings. We're all human beings, and we share these common wants and needs. And when we can tap into that and level the playing field in that way, it's really powerful.
Yeah, I love that. I talk a lot in a number of my podcasts about you can't treat every employee, every colleague, whoever you're working with, your family with the same paintbrush, because everybody is different.
Yeah.
And you talk about a Gen X or a baby boomer, and now, the younger generation, it's different. They have different values, they think differently.
Yeah.
And I know sometimes leaders get frustrated, and I'm like, but they haven't lived the life you've lived.
Mm-hmm.
They never will, because things
No.
have changed. Like back in my day, and Tim, you'll probably giggle, there was no technology. Cell phone was non-existent. I remember taking typing because there were typewriters in high
That's right.
school, like using carbon paper. So
Yep.
things have changed so much
Mhm.
in our lifetime that I often say to leaders, to your point, people just want to be heard. They
Yeah.
want to feel like what they bring is of value.
Mm-hmm.
And 99.9% of people show up to work wanting to make a difference. You'll always have that 0.1% that's there to cause trouble.
Sure.
Right? But generally speaking, so when something happens, You know what? We all have the same common goal at the end of the day. We all want to live good lives. We want to have a roof over our head. We want to take care of our families or go on trips or have fun. We want to enjoy the work we do too. And so I think sometimes if we can go back and remember what it was like when we were in our 20s and starting out,
That's right.
and just have the patience and pause and listen. Like that active listening is so key.
I agree with that. And I like that you touched on the generational differences. There may be listeners who disagree with me on this, but we've heard that millennials are driven by a sense of purpose. They want a strong sense of purpose. I really believe in the work that we've done. Every generation wants a sense of purpose. Yes, it's amplified with millennials, but at the end of the day, you and I want to show up and do something that we feel is making a difference.
Right.
I can remember distinctly early in my career, you mentioned I worked for NBC and Warner Brothers. So I was out in Hollywood, this Canadian kid growing up in Toronto, ending up out in Los Angeles. And although the work was really exciting to work in television, I felt like it lacked impact on society, right? We were making people laugh, we were making people cry, we were entertaining them. But at the end of the day, were we making a difference? And I remember being just so driven to want to make a difference. And I was able to fill that need by volunteering, finding ways to volunteer in the community. But it took me a while to realize that my career didn't have to be focused on that. There were other ways to make an impact, make a difference. So I think a combination of those things, and as you said, just really understanding what a different generation is experiencing, we all really want to make an impact, have a reason to bounce out of bed in the morning. And so I think although we've relegated that to the millennial generation, I really believe it crosses all generations. We need to be aware of that.
Right. And I think our purpose, at least mine, I can't speak for others.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, you could weigh in on this. I think my purpose has changed over the decades of my life
Mm-hmm.
because, let's be honest, globally, the world has changed. Personally, my world has changed, right? There's so many things that change that our purpose, we're still passionate about is something, but that purpose may change. And I often talk about, hence, you want to be able to pivot, right?
Yeah.
Because something that didn't even exist when I was in my 20s and it is now present in my 60s. How do I make a difference in that world? Because it wasn't something that I focused on in my 20s, but it's
Right.
very important now in my 60s.
Yeah. Life experience shapes that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It really
And we
does.
find out as we get older, we find out what's really important, I think, in life. And those are lessons we can't necessarily convey to our kids. They have to go through that experience for themselves, just like we did,
Right.
and figure it out and find their sense of purpose and how that evolves as you get older.
Yeah. And I think business is the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I remember businesses saying, well, we've tried that in the past and it didn't work, but we're at a different time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may work this time, or we may change it slightly to adapt to today's world, but never exclude anything. Because I think, to your point, when we have purpose and really listen to everybody, it can make the world of difference.
I agree.
Yeah. Let's talk about something a little different. So, and I've pulled some numbers. So I'm going to refer to my numbers. So we know over the past 5 years, because we've been through COVID, and I think COVID's changed a lot of things, and we're going to talk about a couple of those. We've seen large scale layoffs shake industries in the US and Canada. You've probably seen it. I pulled a number and it said that there were over 722,000 job cuts in the US in 2024 alone, which blew my mind. Now, I know there's a lot more people, but that's huge, with Canada following a similar trend. So studies show that 81% of companies experience a negative brand impact post-layoff. We touched a little bit on that just in the previous question. And 70% struggle with future talent acquisition because of potentially that brand impact. You know, when we call the tipping point where the cultural damage becomes nearly irreversible, seems to vary by organization. And you know, in one of my episodes, I talked about, do you want to be Microsoft and Apple, or do you want to be BlackBerry and Blockbuster, right? So
Right.
it does really vary. But what do you think separates companies that are successfully, they're able to maintain that high trust, high involvement culture during those layoffs from those that never fully recover?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we do, and people forget this, is we need to give people a chance to mourn the loss. And I think too often, because of the pace of business, that's done. Those people are gone. We're the remaining team. Here's what we need to do. Well, that has huge ramifications, right? You're my friend at work. You've just been laid off. So I'm mourning the loss of seeing you every day, 50, 60 hours a week, and the friendship that we have. I'm probably feeling quite stressed, knowing that now there's going to be more that's hitting my plate because you're no longer there. I'm probably going to be assuming part of your role. All of these things start to mount. We say that culture is how work gets done in any organization. We love just the simplicity of that. Culture is how work gets done in any organization. Well, the way work gets done has now just changed dramatically with people being laid off. I think companies need to communicate carefully. It's a time to communicate. We know there are restrictions on, this best coming from the HR world. There are things that you simply can't say
Mhm.
to employees that you're aware of. Or if you're a publicly traded company, there are things you can't share. But the more, sometimes there are things you can't share. The more you can communicate and stay aligned to your values. If you've done the hard work of defining great values, a great mission, or now purpose statement, a great vision, that can be enormously helpful in guiding the behavior moving forward. There were three things that I just got to go off on a little bit of a tangent here because it comes back to the mourning notion that we have to pay attention to when there's big change like this. There are three reasons that changes inside organizations fail from our work over the last 18 years, and 70% of them fail. That's the failure rate. The first is that there's no change buy-in. So we haven't taken the time to help people buy into the reason that something is happening. Now, if it's a layoff, we don't have the luxury of sitting people down and helping them get bought into that. But often change is happening at such a pace that we don't give people a chance to buy in. We don't give them a chance to see it modeled by us as leaders. What does this new phase look like? And we tend to tell and sell the change. So, Caroline, I'm going to convince you, here's the change. I'm going to convince you that this is a good thing. Do I really believe that? I'm a human being too. Yes, I'm a leader and I've got to move forward with this change. But my inauthenticity is going to show through pretty fast. So being human with you, there's that word again, being human with you as we go through this change, and that this change is going to be difficult, and I'm feeling it as well as a leader, that can help to build more understanding and trust. When this builds up, we have a natural emotional reaction to the change, and that change is fear. Tangential thought that links all this together. People are familiar, I'm sure, with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work in the late 1960s around the 5 stages of grief. And we know those to be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately acceptance. Now, when she architected these, she didn't say that this was a linear process. You and I have both been through grief in our life. It's a very difficult thing to go through. It doesn't mean that we experience those 5 in that order. I may have doubled back to one and lingered there and skipped over others. You may have gone through all 5 in a different order. So she never intended it to be this linear process. It was just a way to understand grief and have a conversation around it. Well, what a lot of people don't know is that she also identified 7 stages of change.
Mm.
And those include shock, denial, frustration. You can imagine as employees are starting to learn for the first time, and as leaders, we're starting to learn for the first time that we're about to go through a massive change. Shock, denial, frustration. Depression can set in, that sense of loss. But then it starts to come out, things start to come out the other side where we experiment a little bit more. So we're starting to lean into the change. We are starting to make decisions and integrate the change into the way we work. Now, it just so happens that those 7 stages of change are a really nice overlay to our approach to culture change activation, which is a a methodology, if you will, that is the beginning of everything we design when we're working with a client around understanding ownership and activation.
Mm.
So think about those initial stages: shock, denial, frustration, depression. There's an understanding piece there that has to be in play. The more I understand the reason for this change, so I may not be privy to the fact that it's coming, but when it's starting to happen, my leader pulling the surviving team members together and explaining why this is happening. There may be significant financial reasons why we're undergoing this change. And then that experimentation, that's an indication of ownership. That's that central part of our methodology, the what's in it for me, how can I take this change forward? And then getting into decision making and integration. That's really the activation piece that we want to equip people to be able to go and move forward. So it's just some ideas on some of the things that we need to be aware of to rebuild a culture when they've gone through a massive change like that, to start to rebuild trust, because trust erodes very quickly when major changes like this happen. And I can talk a little bit about measuring trust and neuroscience and how neuroscience can play a role where we can actually see, I saw you light up, we can actually see in real time that we are building or enhancing trust in a group.
Love neuroscience. I'm telling you, my last episode on goals, I bring in neuroscience because I think it's, as a leader, it's important to understand the psychology and the neurosciences so that you can be that empathetic leader. You can understand what somebody's going through at a certain time. So would love to hear a little bit about that. And I think the other piece I'll add was, I know when we went through some changes at a company I worked for, I had somebody, a colleague actually, reach out to me who was one of the surviving individuals and had lost a number of their team.
Mm-hmm.
And they told me that not only were they upset for the individual who had lost their job, because you have that human connection, you feel bad for them, they are now unemployed, they have a family to support.
Yes.
There's that frustration or anger, if you will, at the business for putting people through that, even though you as a business may do everything you possibly can to make it as easy of a transition as you can.
Yes.
Because those are never easy. But not only the fear of taking on more work, but the fear of what's next. How do I know there's not another cycle coming through?
Exactly.
And so I think you don't know what you don't know, is what I used to say to people. So as a leader, I used to be open and say, you know, if my team would ask, especially in HR, do I know if another one's coming? No, I don't.
Yeah.
Will I say one's not? No, I can't.
Exactly.
But let's do what we need to do. What can we control? Because that's out of our control. So now how do we embrace the change? Because change, to your point, can be good because you start to think outside the box like you never have before, and try and embrace it and show others how they could potentially take it, embrace it, and lead instead of water cooler negativity. And I think that water cooler conversation can be really difficult. And that's why I've said to leaders, you need to have those conversations with your team, because if you don't, they're going to have water cooler conversations. And those are never good because people always go, what if negative, as opposed to what if positive, right?
That's a great point. We've often thought about how we repurpose that water cooler conversation. And we look for, when we're starting our work with a client partner, we look for the people in their culture, on their team, who are positively predisposed to the change. Now, I'm not talking about a layoff. Nobody's positively predisposed to a layoff, but a new strategy that's coming out and people are still getting their heads around it. Can we go and find those people who are actually leaning in? And if you said you want to help with this, they're going to shoot their hand up in a room and say, yeah, I want to be part of this. So by bringing those internal influencers into the conversation early, we can create a positive tipping point inside the organization where others start to see, because it's being modeled by these individuals, the merits of the change. Doesn't mean we're trying to candy coat it or make it something it's not, but to change those water cooler conversations into something that's positive, to have people in the organization who can say, actually, that's a rumor. It's not true. Here's what's really going on. We know, Caroline, that when there's a void in communication, rumor is going to fill it, and it's going to fill it quickly, right? We don't want that to happen. That's where good communication comes into play. That's where having internal influencers. And when I use that term, I mean not people who can manipulate others. It's people who are individuals who others lean into and say, Caroline, I just heard this. Is this true? And because you're one of those people who has a beat on what's really going on, you can say, actually, no, that's absolutely false. Here's what's going on. That can help create some stability as we're going through a change.
I agree, because that individual will then turn around and let others know. And
Correct.
hopefully it squashes it. Because if you have that trust, if you already have that trust in the person who's delivering that information, you're going to believe it to be true, as
Yes.
opposed to, I don't have trust in that individual and what they're saying, therefore I still don't believe. And so, and that's with any change, right?
Yes.
With any
Yeah.
change that comes through. I think change, I've always looked at change as a positive thing, because if you're not changing and you're standing still, you end up being like a blockbuster, right? Where
Right.
you end up having to close your doors. But I think change isn't easy. It can be very difficult. All kinds of change, you may have to go through that grief process.
That's
But I
right.
think if you're ready to embrace change, the ride can be really nice if you're bought into it, and leave that negative stuff behind. We talked a little bit about the woo-woo in my world, leave that energy behind. I just did a post today about burnout and some of the leaders, and if you go through the slides, you'll see a lot of them focus on that energy piece. You want to surround yourself with that positive energy, not the negative energy, because that'll put you in depression.
If you're feeling the weight of burnout or struggling to navigate change, I want to invite you to a powerful experience, my upcoming virtual retreat, Reclaiming Your Energy, a reset for leaders and entrepreneurs. This is your chance to pause, reset, and realign with what truly matters. Through guided meditation, energy healing, and deep reflection, you'll walk away lighter, more centered, and ready to embrace the next chapter of your journey with clarity and strength. If that resonates with you, head to my website to grab your spot. The link is below in the show notes, and give yourself permission to step away from the chaos and into renewal.
So I think it's so important to grieve, because you have to grieve, but
Yes.
embrace that change as quickly as you can.
Yeah.
Even if you're still grieving, still raise your hand and be part of that change,
Yeah.
because potentially what you're grieving over, you can make a difference in that current change.
Correct. And other people are experiencing the same thing. So there's
Sure.
strength in numbers as long as we don't let it go in the negative direction too much. People do need to get that energy out.
Yeah.
There's always, in any change, there's either a pain point or an opportunity. There's something that is happening that we need to address. Maybe it's as serious as the company surviving, that we've got to go through this pain point it may mean a layoff, but we're going to survive out the other end of it, or an opportunity. Here's a chance for us to leapfrog our competition, for example. If we make this change, we're going to be better equipped to serve our customers than they are. So finding that balance within change, I agree with you. I used to think that I'm a person who embraces change pretty easily. I do like change, but there are certainly some life changes that are not pleasant to go through. And again, there's strength in numbers. Having people around us who we can lean on as we're going through that is very helpful.
Yeah. And you're probably talking about grief in particular. I have my own opinion about grief. I don't believe time heals all wounds. I don't believe it. I believe that time allows us to adjust how we feel about the grief, but the grief is always there. But I think grief is an opportunity for us, to your point, surround ourselves with the support that we have, but also to remember how important and how delicate that life balance is, and bring us back to what is important, bring us back to our values. Like for me, when I lost my dad, it was a true sign to me about what do I want my legacy to be? Because my dad's legacy was phenomenal. I had no idea the impact that he had on people's lives.
Mm,
He passed through COVID, so we weren't able to have a full funeral, but the
yeah.
cards and calls and texts that I received about stories blew me away. And so it allowed me to sit there and go, well, what do I want my legacy to be? And how can I make a difference in people's lives? And I think, sometimes it'll take time for you to figure that out. But I think when we go through any form of grief or change, sometimes we can do that. I get frustrated. I was working on a project and all of a sudden the business has decided we're not doing that anymore. I get angry because I just invested 6 months on that
Right.
project. But you know what? There's probably a reason.
Yeah.
And I think with age, you come to realize that. So,
And
yeah.
sometimes we're moving far too quickly. The example you just gave, Caroline, sometimes organizations are moving far too quickly. We worked with one of the major banks in Canada a handful of years ago. They brought in their 300 senior executives from across the country, and they brought us in to help shape what that meeting would be like, what the experience was going to be. And we quickly realized that they were implementing change so rapidly that the front line wasn't able to fully implement the change. So then the leaders were I call it the pancaking effect. They were pancaking another change on top of that and another change. Well, that's not working, so we need another one in there. They were exhausting their front line. So they brought tellers and other frontline employees. Well, we suggested that they bring them to the meeting. You can imagine the reaction. We were talking to the president and said, we would like to bring a cross-section of your front line into this meeting. Well, that's never been done before. Well, what would the impact be if your leaders could hear from them firsthand what's really going on, this pancaking effect of initiatives that aren't given enough time to actually start to work? And these people were leaning in to make these initiatives happen. And then the next thing came. Well, it changed everything. We coached the leaders in advance and said, please be kind and think about the fact that this is intimidating to walk into a room with 300 of the top leaders of your bank, and they are frontline employees. And then we spent a lot of time with frontline employees in a separate room before they came in to build their confidence up and willingness to speak out. Everything changed in the room. When they shared what was really going on inside the organization and how the change was suffocating, the leaders were suddenly leaning in, and it led to a different set of actions coming out of that leadership meeting. My understanding is the years since, they have always brought the front line in to get that voice. Yeah. So it's the example that you raised of working on something and all of a sudden it just stops. And you think, oh, all the energy that went into that. Sometimes we find it's just bad communication from senior leadership down through the organization.
Right. Well, and sometimes they don't know. And we've talked about this before the call, right? Leaders, I always say, talk to your people. You don't have to have all the answers. We don't have all the answers.
Correct.
And so when you're rolling something down, you don't have all the answers, right? So how do we embrace it, knowing that we all have a common goal at the end? And
Yes.
so how do we embrace that so that we're all working towards that common goal, and maybe have to make some shifts along the way, but that's okay because that's what a team does. We work together for that common goal.
Absolutely. And I wish I had learned that as a young leader.
Yeah.
If somebody had told me, you don't have to have all the answers for your team, open up and hear their perspectives on it. They're really not expecting you to give them the direct answer right away. It's okay to say, I don't know. Let me find that out for you. Or what do you guys think? Let me get your input on this. That's not a sign of a leader who isn't strong. I think it's the opposite. I think that indicates a leader who has a lot of self-confidence and can say, I don't know. Too often, as you know, we see people promoted based on their technical ability, whatever area they're in, and yet they really haven't had any management training at all, like good management training. I was sent off to the executive programs when I was with GE, and I was in a creative department. I was running global brand for the company. What I was learning in those offsites wasn't really helping me hone my skills as a leader, because I was working with a creative team and we were talking about how to run a chemical plant in Alabama. Well, that's something I never was going to do in the company. So finding the right, and I don't mean to ding, that's a well-known executive training center that used to exist. It doesn't anymore. GE's changed so much, but I don't mean to ding that. It had its purpose, no question. But finding the right type of training for the right leader to help them enhance those skill sets, help them be better listeners and better decision makers, and knowing how to handle really difficult conversations, being able to be candid in those conversations.
Yeah, and I'm going to make a plug because that's what I used to do as an HR partner or as a coach now.
Loving this conversation? Well, just wait. There's more to uncover. If today's discussion is resonating with you already, imagine what could happen if you took that next step. Stay with me because I've got something that will help you lead with confidence and clarity. Are you leading or are you just surviving? If you're feeling stuck, overworked, and invisible in your leadership role, this is your wake-up call. Hi, I'm Caroline, and I've seen it all. As an HR director, I watched leaders promoted for their skills, but then left to sink or swim in their new roles. No mentorship, no guidance, just trial by fire. But let me tell you, there's a better way. My Strategic Leadership Accelerator program is a 10-week private coaching program designed to take you from overwhelmed and undervalued to thriving as a high-impact, respected leader. You'll learn how to reclaim your confidence and your voice, master proven strategies to secure promotions, raises, and the respect you deserve, and finally achieve work-life balance without burning out through boundaries. It's time to step into the leader you were born to be. Don't wait another day to create the career and the life you so deserve. Visit my website at carolinebear.com or click the link in the show notes to learn more and book your spot today. The Strategic Leadership Accelerator program, because thriving leaders don't just happen, they're made. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Sometimes it's even like if you're an executive, being the partner, giving guidance, sharing experience, accountability, right? Those kinds of things, celebrating the wins that they have. Sometimes it's just holding safe space and
Yes.
asking them questions that maybe they hadn't thought about and kind of going, oh,
Yeah.
you know what? That's a really good idea. And so I think to your point, we could take all sorts of training, and I've done it. I've taken tons of training, and
Yeah.
probably a small percentage did I ever integrate into my life, right? It's all good. Same with books. I'm just looking at the bookcase. All the books I've read, there's probably a handful that have made significant impact in my life.
Yeah.
But I think, again, it's in this day and age, to your point, it's listening, and it's okay to be vulnerable as a leader.
Oh,
It's so,
I
it's
love that
right.
word. I love that word.
It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay
Yeah.
to be human, because that's what humanity is. It's being vulnerable. I mean,
That's
we're
right.
all here to learn. Nobody has all the answers. I don't care who you are. You could be a CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world. You could be a president, a prime minister, whatever you don't have all the answers.
Oh, need each other.
Right? And I think it's when you have a team. I've always said a strong leader, and I was fortunate when I was a director. I had a phenomenal team below me. They made me look good. Because when you have that team and you're able to bring them together and brainstorm with them, it makes them stronger. It makes them more creative. It makes the team stronger. And let me tell you, as a leader, the buy-in that happens is just phenomenal too, because they've been on the journey with you. So I think that vulnerability is, I wish people could line up and you could just hit them with a magic wand and give them that vulnerability.
You saw me smile when you use that word, and it's some of my favorite work that we do with teams. We, as the best way to describe what an offsite that we've designed looks like, and offsites that's not all we do at the involvement practice. We're really looking at the totality of how you build strong cultures that can help individuals, teams, and the company overall grow. But when we're building something after we've done the culture diagnostic, we think of, if they give us 2 days with the team, we think of the overarching experience. What is the end result and why? And this is where the 5 whys that Toyota made so famous are important. Why do we need to get to that point? You get an answer. Well, why? And just keep drilling down. What's the real reason
Mm-hmm.
that we're bringing this team together? What end result are we looking for? And then we build a series of micro experiences. We pay a lot of attention to the fact that we have introverts and extroverts in the room. You can't go 180 miles an hour with a lot of introverts. Introversion is not a bad thing. We just need to give them time to catch their breath, have a few minutes away, re-energize. In fact, I learned something through the neuroscientists that we have on our team, that our brains can actually only take in about 20 minutes of content at a time. And then we need a mental break, doesn't matter who we are, in order to recharge and then go back and take the next 20 minutes in. So if you have on your agenda to bring in a CEO to talk to the team for an hour and a half, they're probably going to hear the first 20 minutes. And then they're going to be a bit checked out because their brains are just getting tired. That's just how we work. That's not saying anything about how dynamic the CEO might or might not be.
Right.
But through the micro experiences that we build and then put together, one of them I love doing with teams that can really move them forward is around authenticity and vulnerability. And it's something we call a framing exercise. They go off and do it. As a facilitator, I don't, and my team members don't walk around and listen to those conversations. Those are meant to be held privately with the teams that are having the conversation. What they can come back and share is how they felt and the impact it made for them. Every single time we go through these experiences with a team, we see trust build, we see the barriers break down, we see the misunderstandings disappear. I didn't realize that when I'm in a meeting with Caroline and I say or do this, it's a trigger for her and she's going to get fill in the blank, frustrated, annoyed, defensive. But now that I've had that one-on-one conversation that's structured, we'll never say a room is safe. We can't create a safe space. I don't know what will trigger you, so we can never say this is a safe space. But we can create a challenge by choice space where you can decide how much you want to lean into this micro experience.
Oh, I like that.
And what we find is that when we do one of those, we might put a small group through a micro experience and then send them back out to do the exact same thing. You see people taking more risk with each other and more risk with each other. And what they learn is remarkable. I've had a team of 5 grown men come up to me afterwards and say, dude, you made us cry. And that actually makes me feel good. And I remember saying to them, I didn't make you cry. You guys went there as a team. That's not what I set out to do when we do these micro offsites. But the fact that they trusted each other enough to share things in their life goes back to the grief that we go through, that the trauma we experience, traumatic events that we experience in our life, don't have to define us. And so those guys had a chance to have a conversation about that. If we can get there through the healing, we can let it become part of the fabric of who we are. That's really rich. Makes us a lot more empathetic, makes us go and volunteer for causes. It has a really positive knock-on effect, but it also helps us heal and move forward as a human being.
Yeah, and I'll use the word somatic healing because I love somatic healing, and I know somatic is thrown around a lot now, so I'm careful when I use it because not everything is somatic healing, but when you can take something that has been a trauma in your life or something that triggers you and dig deep into what's going on and just listen.
Yes.
We do the name it, listen to it, what is it asking for? And how do you show it what it needs is just phenomenal how that trigger just dissipates and it no longer has the impact or the hold that it used to have. It's just crazy. So, I can see how those things, even in a work environment, and I've talked about, I can't remember which episode I talked about this or if it was in a course workshop I was teaching where I'll get an email from Tim and I'll get an email from John. It could be the exact same email, but because I don't care for John, the way I read it is going to be different. And it's going to trigger me.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. And just that psychology of understanding that and changing your behavior around it. Right. Because sometimes you just got to shake it off.
And an opportunity to understand John better.
Yes.
right?
Yes.
We go through life, there's so much going around us all day long that we put things in boxes. It's our way of understanding things. So I may have met John and had a negative interaction with him, and that frames who I think John is.
Yeah.
And then we go through a facilitated experience together where suddenly I understand what makes John tick,
Yes.
and he starts to understand me better. And those things break down, and suddenly I've reframed who he is. So when I get that email from him, it's not going to have the same reaction. It's not going to be the same
Love
trigger
that.
for me.
Yeah. It's so important. So
It is.
important.
It is.
So let's talk about, because transparency to me falls in line with what we're talking about. When I always say transparency can be tricky, because to your point, there are times when leaders or high ups will, like when we're doing layoffs or a change, will only share so much. And sometimes it's because that's all they can share. I've been in that boat, right? You can't
Yeah.
share everything.
No.
You can share this. So transparency can be really tricky. And I've seen leaders struggle with it. They struggle with balancing honesty,
Mhm.
because I want to tell you everything, but I can't,
Right.
and protecting the company's interests. So, in your view, Tim, how much transparency do you believe to be too much? Kind of what's the right approach?
That's a really difficult one. As you said, in your former HR role, you know better than most, right? What can be shared, what cannot be shared. HR issues are very delicate. We have to protect the individual. And the same thing, as I mentioned earlier, with a publicly traded company, you've got stock price that can be impacted. So they're just simply things we cannot share. I think it comes back to our theme of being human
Mhm.
and building trust, being as open as we can, explaining what we understand to be the case as best we can. As we talked earlier, rumors are going to fill the gap in communication. So we don't want that to happen. It's only going to make the situation far worse. But being honest in our communication, and if we don't know, saying that too. I really don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to find out. And if it's something you really can't share, framing why that's something that can't be shared.
Yeah, and I used to do particularly investigations, because
Mm,
a lot of times people would want to know the outcome of the investigation.
yes.
I can tell
Yes.
you to a certain degree the outcome, but I can't go in detail. I can't tell
No.
you whether I've disciplined somebody, fired somebody, whether they've left on their own as a result, right? Like I can't
Yeah.
share those details,
Yeah.
but I can tell you that you have to trust that the business
Mhm.
is following what it needs to follow. As the HR partner, I
Yeah.
completely believe in the process. You just have to trust the process, that everything was done according to what needed to be, and this issue should have been dealt with. If
Yeah.
something else comes up, let me know. But, and sometimes I've said to people point blank, if it was a role reversal and it was you, would you want me to share everything that our
That's right.
conversation had with somebody else? You
Yeah.
wouldn't. So it's my job to protect the individuals. I mean,
Yes.
that's what we have to do, right? So,
Yeah. We
yeah.
had a client years ago who managed downsizing so poorly that their leaders were not getting out in front of it to communicate with the team or teams across the organization. And so people were terrified. What's happening? Am I next?
Mm.
Like you said earlier, if somebody comes to you and says, "Is this it? Are we done? Is there going to be another one?" I don't know the answer to that. But they didn't even go that far. And they were not aligned in their communication. And I'm not suggesting everything gets architected, but we have communicators in organizations for a reason
Yeah.
to make sure that consistent communication, FAQs are available. I mean, it just caused so much damage in the organization because now employees who are left don't trust the senior leadership team
Right.
and are very likely looking at other opportunities. And they may be
Right.
high performers because they were the ones that were left.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So let me ask kind of a part B to that question. You think about the tough messages that leaders have to present a lot of times. It's an emotional burden on people. It really
It is.
is. It really can impact them emotionally. How do you suggest that maybe they navigate their own emotions while
Yeah.
staying present for their teams, because sometimes they're going through it themselves for the first time, and 5 minutes later I've got my team together and I haven't even digested it yet.
Yeah, that's really hard. In that scenario, it's very hard to, because as you said, you're experiencing it emotionally for the first time yourself. I think when you've got an opportunity to partner with, have conversations with your colleagues at your level, that can be enormously valuable. Provide room to blow off some steam, to express your frustration with it, because that's natural. It's part of the process. Your team's going to do it too. But also find ways to support each other and shore each other up, because we need that. We're in it together as leaders, and we need that. Sometimes we're in middle management. We're caught between senior leaders and the workforce. I think even more being that bridge between the senior leadership team and your team is important. And then people being aligned in their messaging. But I think that's where having that friend at work who you can confide in and trust, not one of your direct reports, that's not appropriate, but somebody who is at your level and you can work through it together, because that's where ideas come from too, right? How can we manage this better? What's working with your team that I may be able to adopt in my communication with my team?
Yeah, I love that. We used to, at least in the HR space, I'd obviously have my HR team gather questions that they couldn't answer, filter them up to me, and then with my colleagues,
Nice.
we would get together and formulate answers so that we
Great.
could get back to them. Because I think that was one of the things that I learned early on in my HR career, was that closing that loop was so important if you wanted to gain respect and trust from people,
Yes. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
even if closing that loop again is I don't really have an answer for you,
Mhm.
expand it obviously a little bit with some empathy,
Mhm.
but you have to close that loop, because if you just leave them hanging, they'll never respect you. They'll just be, she never got back to me. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, speaking of trust, and this is a hot topic that I want to talk about, because I know Walmart, at least in Canada, has just recalled all their people back to the office 5 days a week. I know there's a lot of businesses that are struggling with the pros and cons to it. I've been in the HR space to understand elements of it and have my own opinion, but would love to hear, between that and AI. I just recently attended the HRPA conference where we talked about AI and why so many people, businesses, and particularly HR individuals are fearful of AI.
Mm-hmm.
But so let me formulate a question for you based on those two. So, we know that not all businesses fully trust that remote work or using AI when it comes to engagement, productivity, culture, you name it. And I think with automation and distributed teams, the new technology reshapes how people interact with their work.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next evolution of involvement culture? What do you see coming out of there? And then how do leaders build that trusting connection in a world where employees are no longer in the same room in some instances, or sometimes you're not even working with a human, you're working with AI?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on AI. I'm following it and learning like the rest of the world is right now. I used to think that it was a negative. I've been leaning into it and I see the power of it now in the work that we do to become informed, to do research. We were looking for a new customer relationship management platform, and somebody said to me, "Oh, don't Google it. Use ChatGPT, and you're going to get a much." I'm like, wow, I wouldn't have thought to do that. Maybe I'm showing my age. I think we're still working through the impact of that. What it lacks is the human emotion that we bring into the workplace. This whole back to office scenario is a really, really tricky one. I wrote an insight on it that's on our website, theinvolvementpractice.com, when earlier in January 2025, Amazon announced that all employees would be brought back into the office. And it was met with varying degrees of reaction. So some people said, this is great. I've got more attention now from and a direct line of sight to my manager that can help bolster my career if I'm doing a good job.
Mhm.
Others who have specific needs where maybe being in a large room of people is not good for their mental health, or may have a disability of some sort that makes it more difficult for them to get to and from their place of work. There were stories during that back to work order that meant that people were having to relocate. That's major. I mean, that's a big expense. That's a lot of logistics to get there. The way I look at that, Caroline, is that, and this sounds a little harsh, but it was never ours to begin with. The remote work, and I'd say this carefully because if my kids are listening, they are a product of that age where they love the fact that they could work remotely and be very productive and have more balance in life. So I see that side of it. But the fact is that this was thrust upon all of us. We were all scrambling to figure out, how do we get people out of common spaces to protect the spread of COVID? What we have seen, and I'm privy to reports in large companies that under NDA, I can't share, I can't name what I've read, but I've seen enough trend in those reports that employees proved that they could be productive working from home. So again, there's pros and cons in there. We've got balance of life that they didn't have before. They're not getting in a car. They're not spending money on gas. They're not sitting in traffic. They're able to be there when their kids come home from school if they have a family. All the things that come with being able to work from the home. But I also see, we're talking a lot about the human element here. We need connection, right? You and I are having a connection right now, but it's through a video screen. If you and I were sitting in a cafe sharing a coffee, the energy between us is going to be different again. We're going to connect on a much different level. That's really core to the work we do. It's getting people physically together. We can't always do it. We do design virtual experiences for teams, but I always caution teams, it's going to take us longer to get there because I'm now quite good at reading body language in just a small video box. I do have high emotional intelligence. I think you and I both need that to do the work that we do. But it's much easier when we're in the room and we can see that Peter is over there in the corner and not fully engaged. What's going on? How can I draw him in to the conversation? How can I help him challenge himself? There are pros and cons to this. I think it's a dilemma right now. And companies are being very definitive. We're back 5 days a week. Here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where my studio is, we're seeing a mix. We've got a lot of major banks here. This is the second largest banking capital in the country. We're seeing a mix where they're saying 3 days a week back, 2 days remote. There are hard costs involved in not having people come into the office, parking that they're paying for. So I understand from a business perspective, I understand both sides. I think you and I have been around on the planet long enough. We've seen the pendulum swing with everything, fashion, music, you name it. The pendulum does swing. It comes back. I'm seeing colors that in clothing that we saw in the 80s that are now like the hip thing to, not sure I can wear them again. My point there is that the pendulum will settle. We went to an extreme, it will come back. Caroline, you'll remember where everybody was moving to open space. That was what was going to generate this great collaboration, creativity. It was a huge experiment. And in some ways it generated that. And in other ways, people were driven crazy. I need to put my headphones on to escape the noise. I need to go into the phone booth just to think, because we're all so different and we respond differently to those situations. There isn't a one size fits all. And I think organizations are going to sort their way through, but they have to take a stand one way or another. Because we are safely out of the pandemic, thank goodness. Not that COVID's gone away, but organizations need to figure this out still. I don't know what the answer is yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think a lot of it in the conversations I've been having, I've been trying to dig into when I speak with executives, what their true desire is to having them back full time.
Great point.
So I'm a supporter of hybrid. I think it serves both the creativity, the humanity. Let me tell you, there are days where I sit in my office all by myself and I'm like, oh, I just have to go meet somebody at a coffee shop just to have that human connection.
Yeah.
There are people that probably don't want the human connection, right?
Right.
So I think that balance, but to your point, being able to pop into somebody's office and seeing them stressed out or not being themselves, you can't do that when you're working from home if you're a leader. So I think there's that blend and realizing that we need to be a bit more flexible in today's world. But when it came down to it, some of the executives, I think, and I asked them point blank, is it because you don't trust your employees?
Ah,
Because if you don't trust your employees, you have a completely different problem that you're
yes,
needing to deal with.
yes,
And is it all employees? Is it some employees? If it's a handful of employees, why is that? Right? Like you start to have those conversations because let's admit it, companies have proven that they can function not having to go to the office.
correct.
But to your point, I think there's that pendulum swing. We've gone too far both ways. And I think hopefully we'll settle somewhere in the middle
Yeah,
and see what happens, because you could potentially lose some phenomenal employees. You may not lose the ones you want to lose. You may lose some top
that's right.
talent by
That's right.
forcing them to come back. And I've seen
Yeah.
that happen too. So it's
I'm
just
glad you
interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it back to trust because I touched on this earlier, but didn't really pay that comment off and the use of neuroscience to measure this. We are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Zak on our extended team. He's one of the top neuroscientists in the world, and he has studied for 20 years. He has studied the relationship between what happens when oxytocin is released into our bloodstream, and in fact has gotten to the point where he can measure it with a smartwatch. And I'm running his app right now called Six, SIX,
Okay.
and it is showing me that I'm tracking right now the conversation we're having, and the numbers are really high, meaning my brain is really enjoying this process. And at the end, it's going to give me a little report. Yeah, whew, it's going to give me a little report and say, Tim, do more of that. Your brain really enjoyed that. There may be points in our conversation where my brain was feeling a bit frustrated. Why was that? Maybe because I was thinking of too many things at once to share an idea with you. So in real time, my score, I can show you right now. It just dropped from 93 to 86, but it's tracking this on my phone
Amazing.
just based on me wearing a smartwatch. I can wear a sport band. So why is this relevant? What we can measure is trust inside an organization. We can see it real time. We can look at trust pre, during, and post an experience that we deliver for a client. I think many people get so focused on just that middle piece. We're going to bring our team together. Here's the location. Here's what we're going to do at it. They forget that there's a pre-period that we can embrace and architect to create an even better experience when they're together. And there's a post element of an experience that needs to be facilitated and debriefed because our brains make sense of things when we have a chance to digest them. Just going through an experience is not enough. We need to come out the other end and give our brain a chance to make it make sense.
And
So
integrate
we
it.
are, sorry?
And integrate it.
And integrate it.
Yeah.
We're so excited about this technology. When I met Paul a couple of years ago, I said, I've been waiting for you literally my whole career because there's science behind what we do. And in real time, we can see if trust isn't being built in a room with a team we're working with, how do we shift? What do we need to do? What do we need to stop doing and have a conversation about it? Paul likes to say our brains don't lie. So this
true.
measurement is coming directly from our brain. It's not a post-experience survey, which sometimes people tell us what we want to hear. We know that. But we do know that high trust companies experience 50% more productivity.
Wow.
That's significant. So in this conversation, I'm intrigued now how we might measure trust with remote employees both ways, because there is a productivity element there. And the numbers are showing that team members can be productive. Some, I'm sure, are taking advantage of it and really slacking off too.
Yeah.
Right. We're
But again,
human.
you address each one separately. That shouldn't
Correct.
be the catch-all of how you treat everybody. I've always said that all my life.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm gonna, before we slowly wrap up,
Yeah.
what's the one immediate action a leader can take today to improve their involvement culture
Yep.
in their organization?
Yep.
So they've listened to it, they're digesting it. What's the one thing I can do today, tomorrow to make a difference?
So the immediate thing they can do on their own is learn to be a better listener and open up that dialogue that helps to promote trust being built. It's not going to happen overnight if you haven't been doing it, but resisting the need to have all the answers. I mean, it's so refreshing when somebody comes to you to say, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, that can be really surprising for the individual. You want to hear my thoughts on that? Awesome. I do have some thoughts on that. Great. Let's celebrate those. Let's talk about them. The other, and this is again, not self-promotion. It doesn't have to be certainly the involvement practice, but getting that outside perspective is so important. So can you do it tomorrow morning? Not unless you're making the phone call tomorrow morning, but in all seriousness, getting some person or team to come in and help you get a different perspective on what's going on inside your culture today and how you can move to an involvement culture. And the key thing is always discovery, right? We need to do some discovery. In our case, it's a culture diagnostic. That's the way we find out what's really good inside this culture that we need to shore up and celebrate, and where the road blocks, the bumps in the road that are slowing us down, are destructive, that we need to get after to create a healthier culture.
Yes. And speaking of making the phone call tomorrow, would you like to share with the listeners what you're opening up around your 30-minute free call?
Yeah. So we do as you mentioned, a 30-minute free consultation. It's a chance for us to listen and hear what's going on inside your culture and provide some guidance for you. Your listeners can just go to theinvolvementpractice.com and they'll find a number of different calls to action on the site where they can just click that and it'll go right, actually comes right onto my calendar. So I can have that conversation with them. And I would love it. I love to hear what's going on out there, what the current trends are, and then provide perspective to help people move forward. Because I mean, we go to work every day. Let's make it a great place to go to, whether it's our desk at home or a physical building. Let's make the best out of.
Or on the airwaves like us.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes, but definitely check out Tim's website, theinvolvementpractice.com, because it really is. And you've said that you've just revamped it, updated it. It truly is a great place to learn more about what they do and impact that they have on work culture, because it is going to make a difference. You've just heard it. So plus, you can also follow Tim or the Involvement Practice on LinkedIn. He's on other social medias. I'll include those in the show notes. Tim, before we wrap up, I always ask this question for all my listeners. What is the biggest thing you've learned throughout your journey that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I would say the biggest thing is be in the moment. And you may have already seen this on LinkedIn, but this is a friend of mine, Gary Hirsch, who illustrated this for me. For people who are listening, it's an illustration that says be in the moment with one of his characters. Gary runs an organization called On Your Feet in Portland, Oregon. They incorporate improv into the workplace. They are phenomenal. I've known these guys for 20 years. The work they do is absolutely exceptional. And every year, Gary illustrates a mantra for individuals, his friends, his family members, and his clients. And so he had me submit mine, and I got mine in the mail. But it's a good reminder that being in the moment applies in both our personal and our professional lives. I wish somebody had shared that with me 30 years ago, because I was too busy as a 23, 24-year-old trying to figure out the industry I was in and be good at what I was doing. If I had just relaxed a bit more into my career and been in the moment, my creativity would have shown through faster, I think, and I would have had a lot more confidence early in my career.
I so love that. Yes, I think that is always the one thing. If you can just slow down a little bit and be in the moment, that is phenomenal, because that is what we start doing as we age. And too bad we didn't know that when we were younger.
That's exactly right.
Tim, anything else you want to share with the listeners?
No, this has been great, Caroline. It's so nice to talk to you again. You mentioned our website. We put insights up there regularly. We pay attention to what's going on in the world around us and write those insights based on that. And as you mentioned, we are on a lot of different platforms. So whatever your preference is to consume this type of information, we'd love to engage with you too. If you see us on LinkedIn, We have a company page. We have my personal page. I'd love to get the conversation going and know what's going on in the world of your listeners.
Definitely, yes. I'm trying to encourage them to do more of that so that we know what you're looking for and can bring you some of the answers instead of you just struggling on it on your own. So,
Yes. Yeah.
Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure.
So nice
So
to see
great to
you.
connect with you after a couple of
10 years.
10 years. Yes, you
It's been
said
10
it.
years since high school. Holy cow. Went by so fast.
But thank you again. And yeah, I'm sure we'll hear lots from our listeners, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. So thank you again.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Caroline.